Hey all, Alex here at your home of the Music Deep Dive, and it's time for a bit of a different type of video compared to what you're used to. This is going to be a discography ranking. As part of this project, I am going back and listening to certain artist discographies, kind of as I have time. Right now, my reading takes up a lot of my time, so I'm trying to also hit some discographies while I'm at it. I'll expand more upon my music listening approach and how I want to do it for the project that I'm doing at a later date, but I did just complete one major discography, and I figured since I've done that, I might as well talk about the music here. So with that said, we are going to be talking about the discography of Frank Sinatra. Francis Albert Sinatra, born the 12th of December 1915 in Hoboken, New Jersey, died the 14th of May 1998 in Los Angeles, California. The young kid from Hoboken worked as a sort of a itinerant vocalist for a couple of years, doing various gigs around his hometown before landing jobs first with Harry James, then Tommy Dorsey, in the process featuring on some of the biggest hits of the early 1940s, including I'll Never Smile Again, the first ever #1 single on the Billboard charts. Fun fact. Sinatra went solo in 1943 with Columbia Records, becoming a star of radio and the silver screen in the process, but the post-war years weren't especially kind to Frank. His popularity dipped pretty significantly, and he was actually in dire financial straits by the early 1950s. An Academy Award-winning performance in the 1953 film From Here to Eternity, coupled with a landmark record contract with Capitol Records, pushed Sinatra back into the spotlight, and it was in the mid to late 1950s where he made arguably his biggest mark on musical history, I suppose, helping to popularize the 12-inch record as a standard format, and together with collaborators of his such as Nelson Riddle and Gordon Jenkins helped to popularize the idea that an album was not simply a collection of songs but a package in and of itself with its own identity that could convey either a story or simply a consistent mood. Now, this was not a brand new thing to Sinatra. You have plenty of album packages that are based around themes going back into the 1930s. And even stuff like Woody Guthrie's Dust Bowl Ballads, you could argue, is somewhat close to a conceptual piece or a conceptual record. But Sinatra really feels like the first album's artist. He's the first person who is going into recording sessions with the idea of making an album with a consistent theme or consistent mood or what have you. He does this consistently. It is a trademark of his artistic identity, and that is the significant piece here. Sinatra also wielded a dominant hand in the music business as well, forming his own record label Reprise in 1960, which is where he would spend most of the remainder of his career. The music from this era is not generally as highly regarded as his work at Capitol, but we'll get to that. There's some good stuff there for sure. Sinatra maintained a sizable presence in pop culture for the remainder of his life, even as his chart success waned in the late 60s and the 70s and onwards, and his attachment to major entertainment hubs like New York City and Las Vegas continues to be advertised to this day. So, if we're talking about what it means to be a musical artist, Sinatra was probably one of the very first people in pop music history to embody those characteristics in a way that lines up with what we think of as musical artistry today. He exerted creative control and a willingness to be creative, the likes of which were almost unparalleled at that point in history. So make no mistake, this man has a significant place in musical history, which is why we're talking about him. And there are a lot of albums to talk about here, so I'm not going to waste any more time with the preliminaries. We'll be discussing 55 albums as part of the Sinatra discography. The Wikipedia article on his discography lists 59 studio albums, so here are the 4 records that I will not be discussing or ranking in this video. There are 2 records that Sinatra did with Bing Crosby as well as Fred Waring in the Pennsylvanians in 1964. America, I Hear You Singing, and 12 Songs of Christmas. Sinatra isn't even on half the songs on these records, and frankly, neither one Neither one's very good. I actually don't like either one at all. So I didn't want to waste space giving these albums the time of day. They'd be near the bottom. I will say, though, that the blame for those records not being very good is mostly just because the Fred Waring and the Pennsylvanian sound is very cheesy in a way that is incredibly dated. It is very much that kind of standard choral sound that you might find in like an old, like early 50s Disney film or something like that. It's kind of awkward. It's really aged poorly. So no, I don't like either album very much. 1965's My Kind of Broadway is really more of a compilation than it is a proper Sinatra record. It's built off of songs that Sinatra had recorded over the previous 4 years. And there is another record from that year where I suppose you could make that same argument, although I did opt to include it. I went back and forth, but I decided to include that one. We'll get to it in a bit. And then there's 1968's The Sinatra Family Wish You a Merry Christmas. Again, Sinatra is only on half these songs, and again, I don't think the album is all that interesting, all that good, so just not worth talking about. But in any case, let's get into it. Number 55, 1993's Duets. The Duets records were misbegotten concepts, I think, from the get-go. And some of that is not Sinatra's fault. In fact, I think a lot of it is not Sinatra's fault. The guy was nearly 80. Sounds like he didn't want to do the projects to start out anyways. And because Sinatra was very self-conscious about his recording style, he wanted to record all of these songs isolated from the people who he would be duetting with, which is fair enough, I guess, but that means that there is absolutely nothing, zilch, in the way of chemistry on this record. Closest you get is the closing track, All the Way, paired with One for My Baby and One More for the Road. And again, there's no chemistry there. It just works better because he's duetting with Kenny G, which means Sinatra is not clashing vocals with some of the people on this. Not a big fan of the Aretha Franklin duet. And the Bono duet, I've Got You Under My Skin, is unlistenable. I mean, it is horrific. It is really bad. I mean, I suppose you could argue that Bono is at least embracing the fact that this was not going to work and just makes zero attempt to try to match Sinatra's tone. But boy, it's horrific stuff. Not a terrible album. Most of it is bland rather than being outright bad, but definitely a low watermark in his career. So that's why it's at the bottom. Number 54, I have 1994's Duets 2, unsurprising. This is a little bit better because I think the song choices and the arrangements fit Sinatra's voice better. It does contain the best track, the best single track in the Duets records, that being Moonlight in Vermont with Linda Ronstadt, which I think is really lovely. And I do like the Antonio Carlos Jobim track, Fly Me to the Moon, on here. I do like that rendition. Otherwise, again, it's mediocre. There's not much that is outright bad on here, but there's no reason to go back to the Duets records, in my opinion. There's no artistic value here. It was, I think, very much kind of a charity project for Frank, as I think people knew that he was kind of near the end there. Had symptoms of dementia at that point, stuff like that. So not a great record, pretty poor, but it was an improvement from what came before it. So number 54, Duets 2. Number 53, 1980's Trilogy, Past, Present, and Future. Oh boy, this is a Todd in the Shadows core record, and by that I mean that Todd in the Shadows could probably create an excellent YouTube video on this album. This is a 3-part triple record. The past section is Sinatra doing renditions of old standards. Pretty good, not too bad. The present section is Sinatra doing renditions of contemporary songs. He does this a lot in the late 60s and 70s, and it's almost never good, and it is not effective here. I don't like his rendition of Just the Way You Are, nor his rendition of Something, although that one does make me laugh a bit. But the kicker for this record is the future section, which is this conceptual piece about how Sinatra envisions the future of the world, but also how he reflects that on his own aging at this point. And it is the most batshit thing he ever did. Listen to the first track on the third record, What Time Does the Next Miracle Leave? It is about 10 minutes long, and it's like, if you know the Carpenters song, Calling Occupants of Interplanetary Craft, think that, and that's about the level of just kind of insane that it is. Highly recommend. The Future section is not good, but it did make me laugh a lot on almost every song. So, ambitious project, but very just caught up in itself, caught up in its own ego, and just way too fucking long. So, number 53, Trilogy. Number 52, 1974's Some Nice Things I've Missed. Fully half-assed record. There's a lot of contemporary cover choices that give off very how do you do fellow kids energy. You Are the Sunshine of My Life, I don't really like that cover. I really don't like the Sweet Caroline cover. And Bad Bad Leroy Brown. Sinatra, I guess, had an affinity for that song because he would perform it live a lot. But I do not think it works. What Are You Doing the Rest of Your Life is okay. But Satisfy Me One More Time. Up-tempo jazz record, so you would think it works, but boy, Sinatra sounds horny as shit on this one, and it's very uncomfortable. So, do not recommend. I mean, it's a nothing record, but more bad than good here for sure. Number 51, 1966's That's Life. Sinatra in the mid-60s, there's a point in time where he really starts to try to imitate Dean Martin, really trying to take over, or build off of that success, because Dean Martin was having a lot of crossover pop chart success at that point. And Sinatra had some of it, and very rarely it works. That's Life, it does not work at all. He's clearly uncomfortable trying to sing to these backing tracks. These arrangements are incredibly corny. A couple of decent moments on here. I don't mind Sand and Sea. The title track is okay, but it's pretty messy, and it's the most indicative of like Sinatra really trying to stay relevant and just not succeeding at it whatsoever. Not an enjoyable listen. Number 50, 1950's Dedicated to You. Strange album, in the sense, it's hard to talk about, I guess is what I'm trying to say. A lot of the Columbia records are a little bit difficult to talk about because they don't work as albums in the way that the Capitol and Reprise records do. These are kind of what feel like single collections. Dedicated to You is the most anonymous of them all. I don't remember much here. These are the most kind of anonymous, like, bland vocal performances that Sinatra's put, at least to the LPs. I know the Columbia singles, like, if you go down that rabbit hole, there's some gems in there, but there also are some complete duds, and we don't have any of those here. I do like The Moon Was Yellow, but definitely the most anonymous Columbia record, and it lands it pretty low on the list as a result. Number 49, 1973's Old Blue Eyes Is Back. This was his quote-unquote comeback record after a retirement that lasted something like 2 years. And the comeback record is a very mediocre soft pop affair. A couple of solid songs. I do like There Used to Be a Ballpark on here, and his rendition of Sondheim's Send in the Clowns is pretty good. But a lot of this is schlock. And yes, a lot of late 60s and early 70s Sinatra music is schlocky, I guess. But his voice is no longer able to really kind of rise above here. It's definitely deteriorating at this point. And it's pretty freaking bland. If you like that kind of MOR music from that period, I generally do, but I still don't really like this very much. Hard to recommend this. And the closing track, Noah, is complete trash. So, skip this one. All right, so you can probably tell that the lighting has changed, and that's because I realized I forgot to talk about my number 48 in the video. So I'm going to talk about it here. My number 48 is 1984's L.A. Is My Lady. L.A. Is My Lady. Quincy Jones on the arrangements. First time he worked with Sinatra since the Basie records. And keep in mind that this is 1984, and Quincy Jones in 1984 was doing work with a guy you may have heard of called Michael Jackson. And so I think there's that anxiety that some of that is going to seep into Sinatra's work. And I suppose it does in a sense. There's more keyboards on this record than there are in like any Sinatra record, like way more. Um, and it does clash a little bit tonally, like seem a little bit out of place. But for the most part, it works pretty well. It works better than you would expect, anyways. I mean, these are still like mostly mediocre songs. I don't like his rendition of Mac the Knife very much. But the record has its moments, and I actually like that this fresher production sound seems to kind of push Frank out of his comfort zone a little bit, and seems to like rejuvenate him a bit. The magic has kind of faded from his performances. He's 69 years old at this point, you know. I mean, you're only going to get so much, but there are moments of greatness here, and again, it feels more fresh than the other Sinatra records from this period, is really what I'm trying to say, which is a good thing. So, LA is My Lady, number 48. Not all that good, but it is kind of a nice change of pace. Number 47, 1948's Christmas Songs by Sinatra. And it might be a bit of a controversial opinion when I say that I'm not super big on Sinatra as an interpreter of Christmas music. I just don't think he ever really connects to these tunes. Like, you hear Bing Crosby or Andy Williams sing a Christmas song and it feels like they can kind of capture that magic. Johnny Mathis is another one. They really get that like enthusiasm for it. Sinatra never really stoops to that level, I guess. Like, it's almost like he considers himself above that type of music. I don't know. The point is, this record is exceedingly bland. The arrangements here are very stuffy, very uninspired. You compare them again to what Crosby was doing on Decca at that time, and it's a night and day difference as far as I'm concerned. And again, Frank doesn't sound super engaged with the material. I do like the closing track, Santa Claus is Coming to Town. I've always liked Frank's version of that one, but pretty bland. Not something I would spin on my turntable as the holiday season comes around here. Number 46, 1962's Sinatra Sings Great Songs from Great Britain. Stunning sounding record, like from a sonic standpoint. It's one of the best engineered Sinatra records. And the arrangements by Robert Farnon are very nice as well. But they also are very languid. They just kind of sit around. There's not much motion to them. And they actually remind me a lot of some of the Columbia tracks. It feels very kind of out of time and not in a good way. It just kind of feels like it's stuck in the past. I like a couple of tracks here a decent bit. I like We'll Gather Lilacs in the Spring. But this record, there's no pace to it. It drags more than it needs to. So not one of the essential reprise releases by any means. Number 45, 1968's Cycles. This is Sinatra doing Baroque pop with a mix of country in there at times. This kind of feels like the time when Sinatra was introduced to Glenn Campbell's music. And I actually really like his cover of By the Time I Get to Phoenix on here. For the most part, though, this is exactly what you'd expect from the descriptors that I used at the beginning. It does not really exceed those expectations in any meaningful way. The first track, Rain in My Heart, is really good, very dramatic arrangement, but it's not indicative of what you're going to get for the rest of the record. You have stuff like Both Sides Now, which is very Judy Collins-esque in its approach, except Judy is a fit for that type of sunny arrangement, and Frank is not. Not a bad album. It's pretty pleasant to listen to, but again, most of these Sinatra records are pleasant, and there's not much substance behind this one, so that's why it lands as low as it does. Number 44, 1966's Strangers in the Night. Might be a bit of a controversial take because this is kind of a popular Sinatra record, and these are mostly fundamentally fine songs. I don't necessarily mind the songs on here, but Sinatra really, there's something about his vocal approach. You get this in some of his later records too. Sinatra sounds like he'd rather be anywhere but the recording studio for the majority of these tracks. Like, he sings these vocals with contempt. And the reason it's not lower is because, again, these tracks are fine, and Sinatra still has enough of a voice to sound good on these, but he doesn't sound like he's having fun. Also, a lot of organ on here. Nelson Riddle, I guess, had this, like, fascination with organ at this period. There's so much of it here that in my notes I said I can't tell if my taste buds are craving green onions or Cracker Jacks more. Couple of good tracks. Summer Wind, probably the highlight on this one, but not very high. in my esteem for Frank's records. Number 43, 1963's Sinatra's Sinatra. This is a remix album, re-recordings of tracks that he did at both Columbia and Capitol. It's mostly fine. There aren't really many comments I could make about this, except that his version of In the Wee Small Hours of the Morning is very dull. They lower the key and they really strip back the arrangements here, and I do not think that works at all. So apart from that, there's nothing egregious. It's pretty by the numbers. I would never go to these over the originals, at least for most of these, maybe one or two exceptions, but it is what it is. It exists. It's fine. Give it a listen. Number 42, 1964's Softly As I Leave You. This is where Sinatra really starts to lean into the pop crossover influences here. This is very much a disservice to his voice. As I said, he doesn't fit for these types of backing tracks, and the result is that the mixture between the voice and the backing track is really awkward sometimes. None more so than the song Pass Me By, which is just really awkward attempt at like a joke track type of thing. The title track is really nice, very pleasant. Here's to the Losers is cool. But again, this is, we're in this period where there's going to be a lot of great albums and interesting albums to talk about, but this is the mediocrity at this point. So not much to say about this one either. Number 41, 1965's A Man and His Music. This is dubiously counted as an album. There are only 3 brand new songs on here. About 3/4 of this material appeared on previous Sinatra records. The rest were parts of singles and soundtrack releases from the period. The reason why I think it's fair to count this as an album is that it's meant to be taken as this like conceptual piece, I suppose. There's a lot of spoken word bits between songs where Sinatra's kind of narrating his life story, his interpretation of his life story. Whether that adds or detracts from the experience, I guess that's up to you at home. I don't know that it does either. And as a collection of songs, it works well. Works well enough. But this is a double record, so be prepared for a longer release than probably what you're looking for. Do I recommend it? Not really, but it is an interesting curio in the catalog. Number 40, 1949's Frankly Sentimental. We really start getting the glimpses of these more mature arrangements that are backing Sinatra here. Tracks like Laura and Fools Rush In, One for My Baby. We start to hear Sinatra's voice take on a more mature tone, like we'll see in the Capitol records, which is a really nice thing to have. Again, it's very, we're in kind of the infant stages of this, the gestation period, I suppose. So he's not come into himself quite yet. But what we get here is nice. So it's a promising record, not a great one, but you get a sense of where he's about to go in the future. And at number 39, I have the debut, 1946's The Voice of Frank Sinatra. There's some lovely vocals on this one. I mean, this is Frank's prime, like, younger years voice at this point. Tracks like These Foolish Things, Try a Little Tenderness, some really great youthful performances here. A bit raw. Again, I mean, Frank had been with the label for about 3 years here, but it still sounds like he's kind of uncertain of the sound that he wants to run with long term. But that youthful exuberance, I think, is what brings this a little bit over, like, Frankly Sentimental, which I just talked about. Some really just lovely performances here. So give it a listen, and give some of the Columbia tracks a chance too. I mean, there'll be some more that'll be higher up in the album ranking here. But Columbia Frank is nothing to sneeze at. It's just that the gems are going to be the singles for the most part, not as much the actual album tracks. Number 38, I have 1961's Swing Along With Me. Billy May on the arrangements here. This is one of the early Sinatra records where it feels maybe a little bit phoned in at times. The arrangements here, I think, overpower Frank's voice. Some of that is production for sure. I think some of that might be Sinatra not necessarily giving 100% in these arrangements. There's some good tunes here. I like Don't Cry Joe. Granada is very interesting. But 61 and 62, especially, as we're going to find, have a lot of like swing records here that are very interchangeable. And this is probably the one where Sinatra seems the least invested. So that's why it sits a little bit lower in this list. Number 37, 1962's All Alone. Gordon Jenkins reuniting with Frank here. It's a pleasant listen. However, Sinatra sounds a little bit ragged sounding. His voice kind of, he was touring a lot during this period, so his voice was a little bit gone. And as a result, he kind of sounds like he's going through the motions. He's not really connecting with these tracks, which is a shame because there are some good songs here. I like Indiscreet. I like The Girl Next Door. The Elvis cover, Are You Lonesome Tonight, is kind of funny. I sort of wish that he had done the spoken word section in the middle, but alas, we don't get everything that we want. Charmaine is pretty good too. But yeah, one of the, as far as the saloon records go, if you will, this is one of the more forgettable ones. Number 36, 1957's A Jolly Christmas from Frank Sinatra. Again, might be controversial, but I think this album suffers from some of the same problems as the Columbia release. It's very melancholy, very stately, and kind of generic in its arrangements. The vocals here are stellar, that's what I'll say. Even if Sinatra isn't necessarily connecting to the joy of the season because the arrangements don't give him a chance to, he really just, I mean, this is peak Sinatra at this point, the late 50s, and he gives his all, you know, from the dramatic sense, I suppose. Really like his rendition of Have Yourself a Merry Little Christmas. I'll Be Home for Christmas Too. Those are the types of songs that Sinatra will excel at, and of course he does here. But I'm not at the point where I could quite consider this a Christmas classic, at least in terms of what I spin during the holidays. Number 35, 1964's Days of Wine and Roses, Moon River, and Other Academy Award Winners. This is a kind of an uneven record. I mean, there is a through line here in the concept. These are all songs from films, obviously. But some of the interpretation choices are very bizarre. And you mix these kind of weirder tracks. Like, I'm not a big fan of his rendition of Swinging on a Star. You mix those with some excellent interpretations. I love his rendition of Love is a Many Splendid Thing. Super fantastic vocal here. And then a rehash from Sinatra's Sinatra for no reason. Just they decided to reuse a track here, I guess. But in any case, I mean, it's a fine record. It's good enough, but uneven. And that's going to be kind of the through line over these next few Sinatra records, especially. Number 34, 1967's The World We Knew. This record is erratic because Sinatra is working with a lot of different collaborators and arrangers here. So he's kind of going in a bunch of different directions, and it doesn't leave this album with much of an identity. What we get here, for the most part, is pretty solid. I really like the title track. Great kind of vocal on that one. The Nancy Sinatra duet, it's one of my least favorites on here, but it's harmless. And again, it did very well on the charts, so who am I to comment? I also really like This Town and You Are There, too. Some people say this is Sinatra leaning into rock influences a little bit, which I assume is because they heard that one guitar lick on the title track and just assumed this was going to be a rock record. There's more good than bad here. As far as like Frank leaning into vocal pop, contemporary pop sounds, I think this is one of his more successful efforts. Number 33, 1969's A Man Alone, the collaboration record with Rod McEwen. This is a very interesting album that I wish I liked more than I did. There is a mixture. The real thing that kind of hinders this album is that it is a mixture of songs and spoken word pieces, poetry that McEwen wrote for Frank that he recites. And a lot of the poetry is contained in the second half of the record, so it does not flow very well. And because of that, some people consider this album pretentious and an abject failure from a conceptual standpoint, I actually think that it hits the mark better than one would expect. Hearing these types of lyrical ideas interpreted by Sinatra, I think, is really cool. I like the title track. I like Love's Been Good to Me. The Single Man is solid. And some of the spoken word pieces combined with the backing arrangements actually work really effectively. Like, I really like Night, the second track on the album, especially when you think of Sinatra's own relationship to nighttime imagery and things like that. I think that's a really interesting juxtaposition. So, A Man Alone is not very high on this list, coming in just below halfway. But this is an interesting record, and one I'd wholeheartedly recommend at least giving a try, because if you like more eccentric ideas, this might be one of the Frank records that clicks with you. Number 32, 1981's She Shot Me Down. How about this album? A lot of absolute shit coming out in the 70s and 80s and 90s from Sinatra. And then there's just this little, not quite diamond in the rough, but gem, I would say. Sinatra and Gordon Jenkins, their last collaboration. And they, after the Misery of Trilogy, they come together to pull this hat trick out of their asses. It's not quite classic Frank, but it's a damn good imitation. This really, like, Sinatra's voice, again, like, works with these arrangements pretty damn well. It doesn't hinder anything, and Jenkins' arrangements are muted enough to really capture some of the intimacy of those early saloon records. I really like A Long Night. The title track is very interesting. Hey Look No Crying, I really like. Little bit weaker on side 2, which is what kind of keeps it down a bit for me, but very interesting kind of out of the blue moment of greatness or near greatness from Sinatra towards the back end of his career. Number 31, 1971's Sinatra and Company. This record is split into two halves. The first half of the record is leftover material from what was going to be a second Sinatra Jobim record. This material is very good. It's not at the level of the first collaboration between the two, but it's very good. The track Wave especially, I absolutely love. The second half is the weak point of this record and really drags it down. Again, you have some misguided pop covers. I don't like Sunrise in the Morning very much. The Close to You cover is iffy. I actually don't mind his rendition of Bein' Green, made famous by Kermit the Frog. I actually think that's one of the better interpretations on side 2, which is not necessarily a compliment. So again, uneven, but you have some pretty strong highlights on side 1 that save it. So if I were to recommend anything, give a listen to side 1. For side 2, maybe listen to Lady Day, which I believe was a leftover from the Watertown sessions. So, but otherwise, you could probably skip the rest. Number 30, 1961's Come Swing With Me. So this is where it gets confusing. Come Swing With Me was released at about the same time as Swing Along With Me. The two used the same arranger. Billy May arranged both records. However, they were released on different labels. Come Swing With Me released on Capitol, Swing Along With Me on Reprise. And the thing with this is there's not much difference from a song quality standpoint between the two records. The main difference is that Come Swing With Me, I think, sonically sounds a lot better, which makes sense because Capitol Studios were some of the best in the world. And I suppose you could argue the song selection is at its core a little bit better. I think the standards that they select here are stronger. I like Frank's take on Sentimental Journey. Yes, Indeed is good. So it's a strong record. It's a pretty solid record, at least. Capitol, towards the end, the Capitol releases were kind of taking a dip in quality, with one noticeable exception. But they're still a fair step above mediocrity. This is still pretty damn strong vocal pop from the era. Number 29, 1947's Songs by Sinatra Volume 1. What uplifts this record compared to the debut is that I think the vocals here are stronger. Not more mature, necessarily, but these are very powerful performances. Tracks like Over the Rainbow, and especially All the Things You Are, one of my favorite Columbia-era Sinatra tracks, if I'm being honest, just kind of puts it a little step above. This is maybe not quite peak Columbia Sinatra, but it's pretty close. And that's what kind of takes it this next level. So, very consistent record too. Just consistently enjoyable ballad Sinatra. Number 28, 1962's Sinatra and Swingin' Brass. Kind of a sequel to Ring-a-Ding-Ding as far as Sinatra kind of just embracing his goofy goober side, if you will. It's a very fun record, very silly at times, and occasionally the song selection delves a bit too much into novelty territory, but it counterbalances it with some amazing highlights. I love Don't You Go Away Mad. I think the performance and the arrangement on that track is stellar. There's some other strong highlights like At Long Last Love and I Get a Kick Out of You. Really fun swing record from the era. We're getting into like unabashedly good Sinatra albums that I would recommend at this point, and this one is no exception, so give it a listen, as well as the ones that are coming above it. Number 27, 1969's My Way. Some people call this a bit of a sequel to Cycles as far as how Baroque pop influences this record, and I see that to some extent, and you do get covers of contemporary songs that don't always work. I don't love his rendition of Yesterday, but there's a lot more swing tracks here compared to Cycles, which is nothing but a good thing, honestly. And the title track on this thing, everyone knows My Way. I don't think there's much that needs to be said about it. It is a powerful vocal performance, a powerful arrangement by Don Costa, and it just feels loose. This record feels loose, and like Sinatra's not trying to fit himself into something he's not comfortable in. You get that on the title track. You get that on stuff like Didn't We and If You Go Away, some really great ballads. He feels comfortable here, and it's really nice. So this is a very nice listen. One of his better late 60s records for sure. Number 26, 1961's I Remember Tommy, Tommy Dorsey tribute record, and fittingly they get Axel Stordahl to do the arrangements here. Very much a throwback to the Columbia Records sound, and I've praised it here. It's not my favorite Sinatra sound by any means, but it does allow this record to contrast nicely from the other releases of this time period, and I do think that this retro sound works better in this context than it does on stuff like songs from Great Britain, for instance. Take Me, probably my favorite song on this record. I also like the arrangements of Polka Dots and Moonbeams and Without a Song as well. Number 25, 1961's Ring-a-Ding-Ding. This is the first record that Sinatra did on Reprise, and clearly I think this is Sinatra trying to do something lightweight to start off. And he succeeds in doing that, and dare I say it, he almost makes a genuinely trivial record in the process. It's fun. His voice is in top shape. However, I think when you compare it to the stuff that came before, this is it's a weaker batch of songs, which drags these recordings down a bit, but the energy alone carries this album in a way that maybe it doesn't deserve to be because of the qualities of the songs. I love his rendition of In the Still of the Night. I think that is stellar. And there's some other very fine highlights on here. I actually like the Coffee song. That's one of his more novelty tracks, but that's actually one I can get down with for the most part. So, solid record. No real complaints here. Nothing worth harping on about at any rate. Number 24, 1966's Moonlight Sinatra. These are 10 songs that are centered around or about the moon, which is a nice little concept, I suppose. But Nelson Riddle handling the arrangements here, which is very nice. It is a bit MOR as far as Riddle's work goes, but that's also because the standards for him are very high. Still better than the stuff he was doing on like Strangers in the Night. This is a very consistent record, a very pleasant record, and that pleasantness is actually kind of unusual when you consider how much angst there is in a lot of Sinatra records, at least the saloon records. So this doesn't really fall into that category. It's just very mellow, and because of that, very consistent and a worthwhile listen. Not one you're going to engage with intellectually compared to some of the other Sinatra records in this milieu, but if you're just looking for like something to listen to as you wind off to sleep. Hard to get much better than this for sure. Number 23, 1950s Sing and Dance with Frank Sinatra, the best of the Columbia records, the only one that I would honestly consider to be great. George Saravo does the arrangements on here, and this thing is fun as hell. The arrangements just capture a liveliness that it feels like the charts that Nelson Riddle would make in just a few years would kind of build off of and only further improve. And I suppose you could argue this album does kind of blow its load at first because it starts with Lover, which to me is absolutely one of the best Columbia records tracks that he ever recorded. It's absolutely fantastic. A wonderful bit of swing, just so much fun. But everything else is really strong. It really is. And just compared to, like, if we're talking about just the albums and focusing on that, this is the only one that is actually up tempo. Which in itself is already like a rating boost, I suppose you could say. So very fun album. He does swing better later on, but this is a great starting point. Number 22, 1968's Francis A. and Edward K., the Sinatra Duke Ellington collaboration record. Very exciting in theory and works pretty well overall. The actual performances and the arrangements are absolutely fantastic. Really what prevents this album from getting even higher than it is a combination of Sinatra's voice not necessarily being great. I think he was dealing with a cold at this point when recording this. And the mixing, at least from like the stereo standpoint, the stereo mix is not very good. Everything is kind of cluttered. The voice is buried. Ellington's piano, you can barely hear at all. And it's just kind of a shame. Because yeah, these songs fundamentally are really strong. I really like Sunny, All I Need Is the Girl, Indian Summer is fantastic, as well as the closer, Come Back to Me. It feels like there is a fantastic, or at least really great record clawing its way to the surface, trying to get out, and it just can't quite get there. But I still rate it pretty well. It's a strong collection of songs and an interesting collaboration from two titans of early 20th century popular music. Number 21, 1957's Close to You. Very intimate record, kind of the forgotten Capitol saloon record, if you will. Part of the reason for that is that the accompaniment here is very sparse. This is only a string quartet accompanying Sinatra, and that's an interesting take. I do like that, but it does make it feel admittedly a little bit trivial compared to the other saloon records. It's just very soft, kind of throws you back again to that Columbia sound. But that triviality doesn't remove its qualities. It's very sweet. It's very pleasant. And there are some really great songs on here. I love P.S. I Love You. Title track for sure. It Could Happen to You. The End of a Love Affair. It's very pleasant. You get to hear Sinatra's voice, not at its most dynamic, but perhaps at its most refined, which is a great thing. Number 20, 1960's Nice and Easy. This record is pretty much a grab bag of what made Sinatra great in his prime. You get both slow and fast songs here, which is really interesting. I do like that in theory. However, this is not peak Sinatra necessarily. It's not the selection of the material. I feel like it is the execution on some level. He's not quite digging into these songs as deeply as you'd expect him to. And I do think that the mixture of slow and fast tracks makes this feel less cohesive than the previous Capitol records, which were kind of one or the other type of thing. But there's a lot of strong moments here. I love the title track, How Deep is the Ocean, his version of Fools Rush In here. There's still a lot of great individual performances, and maybe that's what I'd say. Like, individual tracks on here are fantastic. It just doesn't flow super well as a collective piece. Number 19, 1961's Sinatra's Swingin' Session. This is a barn burner of an album. Less than half an hour long, but it knocks your socks off with just swing track after swing track. It just hits bam, 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 bam. And maybe there's not a lot that's absolutely like fantastic and like knock your socks off good, although September in the Rain is pretty fucking great. It doesn't really matter because this is so much fun and so fast paced that you're just vibing, you're jamming the whole time. Like I said, September in the Rain, You Do Something to Me is pretty good. I Concentrate on You is probably my other favorite on here. Just it's a lark, it's fun, and it's trivial on some level, but these aren't joke songs. These are straight up swing tracks, and this is Sinatra showing why in many ways he was the best or one of the best in the game at that point. So yeah, great album, a lot of fun. Number 18, 1962's Sinatra and Strings. First record with Don Costa arranging, and he doesn't really step into the role so much as he just kind of crashes into it. This is a very bombastic record, very overblown, with some of the loudest and most dramatic arrangements that you would find in a Sinatra record to that point. And it is so loud and it's so over the top that it would suffocate just about any vocalist, really. Like, you need a very unique combination of power and interpretive ability to be able to transcend this arrangement. Now, fortunately, Frank Sinatra is not like most vocalists. He transcends that. And if we're talking just about vocal skill, I don't know if this is the best album that he ever recorded in that milieu, but it's certainly up there. He sounds gigantic and powerful on so many of these recordings. Tracks like Night and Day, It Might As Well Be Spring, All or Nothing at All, Yesterdays. I mean, he is really just singing his soul out, and singing really loudly and powerfully. And yeah, I mean, this record proves why he was called The Voice. Number 17, 1964's It Might As Well Be Swing, the second collaborative record with Count Basie. This is a milder effort than the first one was. Not quite as strong of a song selection, and it doesn't swing as hard, I suppose. But it's still pretty damn bluesy. Certainly as bluesy as you will hear Sinatra get, and that can only be a good thing, especially in this era of Sinatra. Fly Me to the Moon is on this, which is obviously a classic, probably the definitive interpretation of that song. I Want to Be Around is fantastic too, is the other clear highlight here. Both of the Basie records to me are pretty much essential listens. Definitely go in order between the two. The first one is better, which we'll get to, and then the second one. But it is very interesting to hear Sinatra work with that type of a dynamic and those very different arrangements. Quincy Jones kind of piloting the show for these records. So really different approach, and both are essential. It's just that I had to put one above the other, essentially. Number 16, 1954's Swing Easy. You want to talk about barn burners of records and just really breezy listens. This thing is less than 20 minutes long, which... combined with the fact that this is just so up-tempo, and again, it's just swing track after swing track, I don't know how it's possible for an album to be breezier than this. But yeah, I mean, this is Sinatra sounding like he has a new lease on life after getting the Capitol deal, and he just glides through all of these songs like so effortlessly. Love Just One of Those Things, Wrap Your Troubles in Dreams, and then the closing track, All of Me, I think is a fantastic vocal from him on that one. It's a lot of fun. It's not as refined as the following swing records are going to be, which we'll get to. But it's still, there's a joy here. There's an unbridled joy here that you don't get in a lot of other Sinatra releases. So a lot of fun. Love this album. Number 15, 1959's Come Dance With Me. This is the first point in time where a part of me wants to say this feels a little bit like we've seen this before, we've done this before. The Billy May arrangements are maybe a little bit blander than what we've come to expect with previous Sinatra records, but this is very consistent. Like just a lot of really strong swing tracks here. And there's enough original ideas and outstanding performances there to warrant a recommendation. Day in, day out, and cheek to cheek, and the song is you on the second half, I think are three of his best tracks in that milieu from that era. As well as the title track. It's very consistent without having a ton of clear standouts. And you're spoiled for choice with 50s Sinatra. Hard to go wrong with this one. And yeah, that's all I got. It's hard to you run out of good things to say about these records. But this one's fantastic. So give it a listen. Number 14, 1963's The Concert Sinatra. This is Sinatra Goes Broadway with a soundstage orchestra on tap to boot. Again, this is Frank at his peak vocally in terms of just power and interpretation. You listen to the closing track on here, Soliloquy. There's so many moving parts to that song. It's 8 minutes long. And so many tempo changes and mood changes, and Sinatra just hits every single one right on the nose. It's really just unbelievable to listen to. The arrangements here by Riddle, maybe not his finest hour. I notice that every song on here ends with like the exact same type of a cadence. He's reusing ideas out the ass, but it doesn't really matter because of how strong the singing is. I Have Dreamed, the opener, is fantastic. Old Man River, I know that was a controversial cover at the time. Still to this day, I think it is. But I think Sinatra does extremely well. And I think does a pretty fitting interpretation, pretty fair interpretation of it. It's Sinatra as a vocalist spotlighted here, which is fantastic. So, Concert Sinatra, number 14. Number 13, 1962's Point of No Return, the last record done with Capitol, discounting the duets records. Axel Stordahl on the arrangements here. However, this doesn't really feel like a repeat of the Columbia sound. This actually feels like a Nelson Riddle impression, and a pretty reasonable one at that. This is pretty mellow. Again, this is like Sinatra not necessarily digging into the cores of these songs and getting the most out of them emotionally, but there are there's moments where he does here, and a lot of the record is still like exceptionally mellow in the best way. It really feels like a strong epilogue for his Capitol output. Love When the World Was Young, I'll See You Again, the closer, Memories of You, is probably my favorite. This is a very overlooked record, and the one going into this where I actually had the least context for. I had heard it before, but I didn't really remember how good it was until I listened to it again. But yeah, it doesn't necessarily stack up to the best of his saloon records, but it's a pretty excellent freaking interpretation. It comes pretty close. Number 12, 1958's Come Fly With Me. This is Sinatra cosplaying as World Traveler. Doing all of these songs about kind of going to various different destinations and stuff. It is a bit top heavy, I suppose you could argue. There's a couple of songs that are, 10 out of 10 tracks. The title track is fantastic. Moonlight in Vermont is unbelievable. I'm also really partial to April in Paris. But there are definitely some weaker moments. I'm not a big fan of On the Road to Mandalay. Same for like Blue Hawaii, and it's decent, but I don't love it. So a little bit kind of all over the place quality wise, but it's a lot of damn fun. And again, at its best, it's some of Sinatra's best material of the late 50s. So maybe some people are surprised that it's a bit lower, because I know it is one of the more popular Sinatra records from the 50s. But again, there's so much good stuff here. And we're only just getting started, so tuck in and wait for the last 11. Number 11, 1954's Songs for Young Lovers. I do, as much as I like Sing and Dance with Frank Sinatra from 1950, this is the album that followed it 4 years later, and this record hits you like a truck. compared to what came before. There's nothing comparable. Nelson Riddle clearly elevates the arrangements so much just on this release alone, and elevates Sinatra too. I think the reason that this doesn't rate among like the Riddle records to come afterwards is because like Sinatra hasn't quite figured out how to dance around them as much. Like sometimes it feels like the arrangements are doing more work than Frank himself is. But his vocals are already like noticeably wearier than they were in Columbia, more melancholy. So stuff like My Funny Valentine, A Foggy Day, Violets for Your Furs. I mean, just, you know, the interpretive abilities and the abilities to like dance around tempos and stuff like that and different feels. Like you already get that here. And that's just going to build upon itself in these future releases. So it's just outside the top 10, but don't think of this as just like, oh, it's like the precursor, the prologue to Wee Small Hours and stuff like that. Like it's a fantastic album on its own merit and deserves that respect, certainly. Number 10, 1963's Sinatra Basie. As I said, I love hearing Sinatra with Basie. And I think this record, as well as It Might As Well Be Swing, proves how much the arranging of these songs impacts Sinatra's own performances. There's so much energy in the arrangements by Quincy Jones, and then the Count Basie band here, and Sinatra matches that energy just so gleefully. It feels like the most he's enjoyed making a record in a long time. And because of that, it was the most I'd enjoyed listening to one of his records for quite a while. Just, again, there's blues influences here. And, you know, while Sinatra doesn't always do spectacularly well with that, it works exceptionally well in this context. He just knows how to make those types of tracks work. Love Is the Tender Trap. Nice Work If You Can Get It. Learning the Blues. His version of I Won't Dance on Here is fantastic. Just such a strong album, such a fun record. Couldn't recommend it much higher. Number 9, 1957's A Swingin' Affair. This record has the not enviable task of having to follow up songs for swingin' lovers. And maybe this doesn't quite hit the same peaks, but I think what works in this record's favor is its dynamics. There's a strong mixture of up-tempo numbers and slower tunes. I think the balance between the two is very effective, so you get both ends of Sinatra's finest work. Night and Day, I Got Plenty of Nuttin', Nice Work If You Can Get It. The version of I Won't Dance on Here is fantastic. Oh, Look at Me Now. It really sounds good. And this record, I don't want to say that it stands completely apart from Swingin' Lovers, because it is very much a lot of the same type of ideas, but it does tend to fall in that record's shadow a little bit, and I think that's unfair. It's not quite as strong to me, but it is absolutely worth your time. So if you're coming in saying, hey, you know, I've only heard Swingin' Lovers, where do I go to next if I want up-tempo Sinatra? This would be my recommendation pretty much without hesitation. Number 8, 1970's Watertown. Watertown is an interesting bird. It is an interesting kind of collaboration that Sinatra did with a couple of people who had recently done an album with the Four Seasons that had received a lot of critical praise, or has received since then, for being a very mature, conceptual-based piece of work. They collaborate with Sinatra here, and this is kind of the only conceptual release he ever did that is actually tied directly to a story. And it runs the risk of being cheesy, especially when you consider the era that this was made in, kind of peak Baroque pop Sinatra. But it works. It works exceptionally well. And I think that's because the Baroque pop influences are incorporated effectively enough to where they don't stick out like a sore thumb. And I think because these are people who, you know, had experience in like the pop music industry, they were working with bands and artists who Baroque pop was one of their main styles. They know the genre. And so they're putting Frank into a situation where he can be comfortable interpreting these songs, and it feels like he has connections to the tracks themselves and the stories that they're telling. You know, all these themes of like divorce and childhood and loss and things like that. Frank owns these, and the results are spectacular. Especially the first side, one of the strongest sides of music that he ever released. I think the highlight for me in the album is Michael and Peter, which is just this devastatingly bare track that really encompasses a lot of the themes of the album, but in a very clever form. Yeah, Watertown it's great. It is better than it has any right to be from being an early 70s Sinatra album, especially when you consider how strong of like a story arc there is. It had every chance to be just kind of a cringe fest, but instead it's pretty close to a masterpiece, and recently remixed as well. So make sure that you pick up that reissue if you haven't. Glad to see that this record is getting more critical consideration than it did when it first came out. So recommended highly for sure. Number 7, 1956's Songs for Swingin' Lovers. Might be controversial. Some people might have this at number 1, but transparently, I think Sinatra is at his best as an interpreter of ballads. That said, this record has an influence, a reach that is miles long. So many jazz arrangers have taken cues from Riddle's arrangements here over the years, and the way that Sinatra kind of glides on top of these, I mean, in a way, it seems effortless. You know, You Make Me Feel So Young, It Happened in Monterey, Old Devil Moon, I Thought About You, How About You, Anything Goes. I mean, all these tracks seem so, like, Sinatra's almost not even trying. He sort of, it feels like he stepped into the studio, took one crack at the song, and that was it. It feels completely effortless, but it's not. Like the phrasing ideas that he's doing and some of the glides to notes and jumps up and down and stuff like that, where he deviates from the main melodies, is just, it's not intrinsic, I guess. And he just makes it feel like, oh yeah, that was always part of the song. I don't know. It's difficult to kind of explain the way that Sinatra was able to kind of define phrasings. And no song is a better example of that than I've Got You Under My Skin, which is a masterful combination of Sinatra vocal and the just masterful Riddle arrangement. It's as good as advertised, and especially when you compare it with like the other Sinatra arrangements on this album and then kind of other albums from the period, you really get a sense of why it stands out in the way that it does, how dynamic it is, just how much of a blast when that trombone comes in, just how effective that is, how different that was. It's phenomenal. This is a great record. This is a phenomenal record, and the fact that there are 6 albums from Sinatra that I think are better than this should not dissuade anybody from giving it a listen. To me, this is his peak as a swing artist, as an interpreter of swing music. So, highly recommended. Number 6, 1967's Francis Albert Sinatra and Antonio Carlos Jobim. Sinatra does bossa nova is something where, you know, without being able to kind of put myself in like the mid 1960s, I think if someone had approached me and asked if that was a good fit, I probably would have said something along the lines of, yeah, that makes sense. I could see him working well. And then it actually happens, and he's collaborating with the sort of godfather of bossa nova, as it were, in Jobim, and the results are spectacular. The Girl from Ipanema is it is the highlight, just because hearing Sinatra kind of glide along that melody, and hearing the things that he does with it, is really effective. But every single song on this album works really well with Sinatra's voice, and when you hear the two of them kind of duet, whether that's like on an actual lyric or Joe Beam's kind of doing his little scat singing backing vocals. It's so calming and it's so well done. And the two of them clearly just click on some level, or like Sinatra at least can kind of transport himself into this style effectively enough to really make it work. And I also think his interpretations of these songs are about as sensitive as a US singer could hope to be with this type of style. It doesn't feel obnoxiously out of place or anything. It feels like it works. It's a wonderful album. Just a lovely, 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 lovely record. Number 5, 1965, September of My Years. What a return to form this was when it came out. Gordon Jenkins comes back, and Jenkins, one thing I haven't mentioned is that people accuse him of being a very cheesy arranger, and that is true on some level. You especially notice that in his works with Sinatra later on, but he tones the cheese and the excess down enough for Sinatra's voice here, and the result is an album that is on the cusp. I mean, it is essentially as good as the classic quartet, I suppose, of Saloon records, which obviously make my top 4 here. Sinatra's voice at this point has really aged well. It's aged like honey, I suppose, or a summer wine, to quote a lyric from one of the songs. And it really fits because, I mean, these songs are about aging. Sinatra turned 50 the year that this was released. And it feels like a natural next step from where he was at 10 years prior, when he recorded stuff like Wee Small Hours. It is a very confrontational release, I suppose. Like he doesn't avoid middle age, and he tackles these subjects in these songs very maturely. And again, because his voice has already matured and is deepened, but it hasn't deteriorated yet, it means we still get to hear the man at the height of his powers. Stuff like Don't Wait Too Long, When the Wind Was Green, the title track is fantastic. It Was a Very Good Year. Just a lot of fantastic songs about kind of looking back or reflection, and Frank just kind of fits them all perfectly, fits them like a glove. So fantastic album, highly, highly, highly recommended. Number 4, 1959's No One Cares. So yeah, of the big 4 Saloon records, this one is the one I have at the bottom of those 4, which isn't saying much because I think the other 3 are 3 of the best albums of the 50s and potentially 3 of the best of all time. This one, obviously, of course, still excellent. Probably the most despondent of those 3 records. Sinatra himself even called it his suicide record or something like that. But I think what makes this one work is that it is despondent, but the arrangements are actually kind of stripped back. These aren't as dramatic as stuff like Where Are You, as we'll talk about. Jenkins, like he does for September of My Years, kind of takes a step back. These are softer arrangements, and he allows Sinatra to, give a more even-keeled vocal performance here. Still, a lot of fantastic tracks. I mean, at this point, every song is a great performance or a great interpretation. Highlights being his versions of Stormy Weather and I Don't Stand a Ghost of a Chance with You. It's very forlorn, I suppose. But like the loss and grief that he's talking about here doesn't seem quite as immediate or present as it is in some of his other earlier Saloon records. So, yeah, no complaints here. It's all strong, enjoyable, but very sad records to come. So, No One Cares is my number 4. Number 3, possibly controversial, 1955's In the Wee Small Hours. I actually thought this was going to be number 2, but it didn't grow off of me. There was another record that grew on me. But and there's nothing to complain about. I mean, this is the definitive Sinatra record in a lot of ways. And the some of the things he does, I mean, again, with Songs for Young Lovers, you were already seeing like Sinatra's ability to interpret these songs and really put his all into these performances. It's already taken a massive step up from where it was at Columbia, and it feels like it takes another quantum leap forward on this album. These records are so melancholy, and when you take that and you combine how Frank is able to play around with these melodies, these like delicious ways, these ways that are very soulful, bluesy, I suppose. There's a lot of Billie Holiday in this record. In some ways, I would say I hear more Billie Holiday influence in this album than I do any other Sinatra record. Stuff like Mood Indigo, which is my absolute favorite and is a contender for my favorite Sinatra song. Just that little bit in the middle where he goes, no, 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 no. Like that is, that goes right to your soul. That goes right to your soul. It's a phenomenal listen. And you combine just everything else with like what this record did as far as legitimizing the LP as a musical consumption format. And I mean, just isn't that much more to say. It's phenomenal, and it's probably the record on this list that most people are most likely to have heard. But yeah, it engages with these musical ideas on a depth that a lot of other pop musicians just would not even coming close to approaching in 1955. So, Wee Small Hours, it's only number 3, but it's terrific. It's terrific. Number 2, 1957's Where Are You? This is the first record with Gordon Jenkins. This was the one that kind of surprised me. I didn't think that this record was going to end up this high on my list, but what I suppose came to realize was Jenkins' arrangement style is very different from Nelson Riddle's as far as Jenkins is very dramatic in a cinematic sort of way. Whereas Riddle, it's more like he has a lot of interweaving lines, different instruments will kind of come up and down, very dynamic in that sense. Whereas Jenkins really builds to like his climaxes and stuff like that. But that style works so well here because it pushes Sinatra to be at the top of his game. And deliver these really just despondent and powerful vocal performances, very grandiose vocal performances. I adore I Cover the Waterfront, Laura, Lonely Town, Autumn Leaves. Just so many performances on here where Sinatra is like riding over these dramatic pieces and is, you know, it's sort of similar. It's the Capitol equivalent to when I was talking about the Columbia release Songs by Sinatra Volume 1, where he's really getting these like powerful vocal performances with these grand like high notes and, you know, these magnanimous finishes, I suppose. And it just it's something to behold. It's phenomenal in that sense. It combines the best of both worlds, I suppose, is what I'm trying to say and not articulating very well. Because you get Sinatra at his most dramatic, while also getting those kind of emotional connections too. These are still, you know, very somber and morose songs. But Sinatra feels very upset, I suppose. Very viscerally, like, you know, powerfully upset in these recordings. And I don't know, this one surprised me. I thought it might be top 5, but number 2 is where I've got it. It floored me when I listened to it. So if you've written off Where Are You, or you kind of said historically, oh yeah, it's probably my least favorite of like his sad boy records, give it another listen. Maybe it's going to be a little bit too Hollywood for you, too cinematic and over the top. I can maybe understand that, but for me, it works it works super effectively. So fantastic. And number one is naturally going to be 1958's Frank Sinatra Sings for Only the Lonely. Very much like I suppose the lesser known cousin to In the Wee Small Hours, but every bit it's equal in terms of quality performances, and I think the fact that I'm putting it at number one tells you that I think it is actually superior. This has there's not a mediocre moment. There's not even a really a good moment on here. It is just so many stellar performances back to back to back to back to back. And when re-listening to it, and I do think the remix from 2018, I think it was, helped somewhat with this perspective. But this was my favorite Sinatra album even going into this re-listen. And I think the reason for that and why I prefer this over at least Wee Small Hours is because I think these arrangements are more complex. They kind of play around more with like the song's pacings and stuff like that. And Sinatra, because of these arrangements being more complex, he has to kind of compensate for that. And he settles into these like gaps so neatly that it's one of the most perfect matches of performer and backing instrumentation that you are going to find. The first two tracks, Only the Lonely, Angel Eyes, remarkable. Blues in the Night is fantastic. Again, Sinatra doing kind of bluesy styles. It works, especially in this period when his voice was at his prime. Ebb Tide is probably my favorite on here. Just a phenomenal freaking song. Really, because I'm not going to be able to articulate much else because I've been recording for an hour and a half now, and my brain is fried. But Only the Lonely, when I did a ranking of the albums from the 1950s that I listened to, and I listened to several hundred, and that includes like a lot of the best jazz records from that period, Only the Lonely was my number one. I think this is among the best vocal pop albums ever released. If you want to classify it as vocal jazz, probably one of the best vocal jazz albums ever released. It's an album that I've read stories of people who will listen to it with one notion of who Sinatra is and what his sound is and come out on the other side completely different. Like this record can change people's minds on Frank Sinatra in a way that I don't even think Wee Small Hours can. So nothing else to say. It's fantastic. So yeah, Only the Lonely is my number one. And we've officially made it to the other side. So thank you for sticking with it. A lot of records that we talked about today. A lot of information. So we'll see in the future, assuming I do more of these videos, I'll probably try to be better about keeping this more condensed as far as the amount of information that I'm sharing, especially given some of the discographies that I know I'll be listening to, which will be longer than this. So we'll get ready for that. But in any case, I really hope you enjoyed. I would be very curious to hear your rankings if you've listened to all 55 of these. And if you haven't, just what Sinatra albums have you heard? And what were your favorites? What are your favorite songs of his? I'd be really curious to know all of that. So if you could leave that down below in the comments, that would be amazing. I look forward to reading them. And with that, we're going to call it here. Thank you so much for watching. Please make sure to like, comment, and subscribe. As always, more reviews are going to come. Hopefully more videos like this will come too. Tell a friend as well, especially if your friend loves blue eyes and fedoras and black and white film. The trademarks, the first things we think of when we think of Frank Sinatra, right? Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you next time right here at your home of the Music Deep